Hello everybody and welcome to another Fire Emblem video here on the channel. I hope everybody's having an absolutely wonderful day. Today we're here to talk about what makes a character good in Fire Emblem. So this is, I guess, an analysis video you could call it. Um, Obviously there are a ton of ways to enjoy Fire Emblem, and there's a ton of ways that people might say a character is good, right? There might be like a narrative reason, they might just really like a character, they might think they're really cool, but what my channel is sort of built on and what we're here to talk about today is gameplay, just gameplay, right? Calling a character good or bad is sort of subjective in a vacuum, but I think it's fairly objective when, again, I sort of give context to it, and that context is gameplay. The reason I'm making this video, and I'm not trying to like call anybody out or say that people are like stupid or anything like that, absolutely not. But I've gotten a lot of comments throughout my time here on YouTube, and a lot, especially recently, as I've been making top 5 lists of people who say that characters that I call bad are actually really good, and it surprised me, especially in a couple of different situations with characters who I think are quite bad, and people seem to suggest are actually really good. So I figured that this video can be a nice sort of, I don't know, explanation of why I think these characters are good. I've always responded to these comments, and I hope I've done a decent job of sort of explaining my perspective. But I think this is going to be a nice cohesive way to explain how I look at characters and how potentially you can look at characters to understand their value in like some kind of tier list or something along those lines. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna lay out three main reasons that a character is either good or bad, depending on like where they fall on this scale, I guess you could say. And then at the end, I want to talk about one of the most common responses that I get on these videos, and why I think that's not a great way to look at characters, and why I think that's a bit flawed. Now, obviously, this video is not like necessarily need to change anybody's mind. Like if you think that a character is good because you think they're fun to use, you should just keep on using that unit, right? But if I make a video where I talk about like who the best character in Fire Emblem 6 is, and you say it's Ray, like that's just not true, right? Like I'm sorry, you can like him, but if like I make it very clear that it's a gameplay oriented tier list or top 5 list or whatever, like that's not the best character in the game. It's just not. So as I said, hopefully this doesn't come off as like being mean or whatnot. But yeah, it should be fun, hopefully, and hopefully informative. So let's get right into it. All right, so first things first, I want to talk about why the gameplay that I've been showing and will continue to show is from Fire Emblem 7. I do have a reason. So this is all taken from my Fire Emblem 7 low tier Hector hard mode Iron Man, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it was a fun run. So I'm not going to explain why it's in the background right now. Hopefully it's enjoyable, but it will be important, or at least have some meaning for the end of the video, so just be aware that if it seems weird, it probably is, but hopefully it'll make sense at the end of the video. But let's get right into, as I said, the 3 things that I'm looking for in a character to make them good. And I just want to mention right now 2 of the characters that I've seen most commonly suggested to me as being a lot better than I think they are, because I consider them 2 of the worst characters, I would say, in Path of Radiance, and one is okay in Radiant Dawn, but one of them is quite bad, and that is Rolf and Nephany. And it surprised me quite a bit that these characters were suggested multiple times as being a lot better than I give them credit. So what we're going to do is I'm going to explain my three things that I look for, and we're going to run these characters basically through them and explain why they are bad in most of these different categories. So number 1, we have class, the unit class. So class is really important in Fire Emblem, because if you have a good class, your things like your stats, your recruitment time, stuff like that matter a lot less. So what kind of classes are we looking for? Basically anyone that gives you extra movement is incredibly good. This is of course cavalry, wyverns, pegasus knights, stuff like that. The dancer class is of course really good. Staff utility, the ability to use magic. Of course this is going to be pretty game dependent, Thracia kind of being the major outlier. A lot of the newer games also might be a little bit different. I'm not going to touch on like what's good in Awakening or stuff like that, because I'm not as familiar with those games, but my assumption is stuff like movement and flying utility is still probably pretty good. Those seem fairly universal in like dancers and stuff. But yeah, Thracia still holds a lot of these same like principles. It's just that like what's good in that game is slightly different. So I'll probably mention that a couple of times. So it is game dependent. Magic, for example, kind of ebbs and flows. For example, it's not that good in Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, but it's a lot better in like the GBA games or Thracia. But these are still pretty good guidelines to go by. as far as what character is good. So how does this apply to Nephany and Rolf? Both these characters are really bad classes. So what that means is they have to have some other reason, whether that be in a class-specific ability, a unit-specific ability, some kind of really strong stats, to be as good as these other characters. Nephany, for example, just talking about her class, is recruited on the same chapter as a Cavalier. And in Path of Radiance, Cavalry is really strong because it gets that additional movement, 2 additional movement for that matter, and gets really strong Canto. So Nephany has to be so much stronger than Kieran, like statistics-wise, to even be able to compete with him. Now, obviously, Kieran is one of the best characters in the game, so this is sort of unfair, but still, I hope you understand like what I'm talking about here. Rolf is the same way. He also has really bad movement. Nephany at least is lance-locked, which isn't so bad. At least she has 2 range. And lances are okay in Path of Radiance. Rolf, on the other hand, is bow-locked, which is even worse, because effective damage is really bad in Path of Radiance, so archers are just terrible. And while crossbows are good in Radiant Dawn, effective damage is also quite bad in that game for anything that isn't a crossbow. So his class is especially bad, given that he doesn't have 1 range with bows. So again, we're not talking about like stats or anything like that, or recruitment time. What we're talking about here is just their class, right? And both of them need to be so much stronger in those other categories to be able to compete with basically any other character in the game. Mia is another great example. Zahark, these characters are just really screwed over by their classes. They're more Path of Radiance specific because they're a lot better in Radiant Dawn. Knights are another great thing that gets brought up. You know, you have stuff like Oswin, who does sort of subvert or go past the bad things with the knights, but like I get, you know, people talk about how good knights are all the time, and it's like that knight has 1 less movement than everyone else. He needs to be so much, he or she needs to be so much stronger than every other unit in that game to be able to compete on like a tier list, because movement is so important. So class is extremely important, and again, both Nephany and Rolf really fail the sort of class test, if you will, because they're just not very good classes. And number 2, number 1 is class. Number 2, I have bases and growths. More importantly, I would say bases. The Jagan, like early Cav or just early unit sort of comparison is probably the best way to look at this. Strong bases is just an extremely important thing to have, and it immediately makes you a pretty good unit. I call these units tempo units a lot. Units that potentially fall off a handful of chapters after they're recruited, but give you really nice utility. You know, Garrett from Fire Emblem 6 is a decent example. Sure, he's not good in the end game. Sure, his growths suck, but like he gives you he's gonna give you value in any gameplay or any playthrough where you need him. Whereas a lot of these growth units just aren't unless you put the time and effort into them. You know, Jagans are almost always the best character in their respective games because they give you that immediate utility, whereas even really strong Cavs need a little bit of time to get going. So let's talk about that in the context of our 2 units, Rolf and Nephany. Rolf is recruited as a level 1 archer with extremely low stats. He's not recruited like super late into the game, which is nice, but Rolf comes with, and this is pretty egregious for Rolf, unfortunately, he comes with Mist, who's one of 2 healers until you get Alencia. Obviously, you can promote mages, but healing utility is really tough to come by in Path of Radiance. So Mist, who's also a level 1 unit, a way better use of your resources. And later on in that chapter, Marcia is going to show up, who's a way better class with way stronger stats, and again, is a way better use of your resources. So every time you're gaining Rolf a level at your base, or you're giving him a kill, you're like essentially not giving that experience to much better units. So Rolf absolutely does not pass this test. As far as growths are concerned, you know, his growths in both games are like fine, but again, he's a bad class, and it's going to take him so long to get as strong as your stronger units. Nephany, I mentioned, you know, her just being a lot weaker than Kieran. Like, her class is bad, and her stats are bad because she's just weaker. She's lower level than Kieran right off the bat. As far as her growths are concerned, Path of Radiance in specific, it's really important to have a good balance of stats, and Nephany is not great with her strength. She is good defensively, I will say, but again, like stats and bases and stuff, she's just not very good when she's recruited, and going forward, her stats are mediocre at best. So these units, again, they need to have some other reason that they're good, especially in the case of Rolf, to be as good as other units. And the final thing I want to talk about is availability. And this is also an extremely important part of this. And this is basically when characters are recruited. Of course, in the case of like Radiant Dawn, availability kind of takes on a different notion, I guess you could say, because characters sort of ebb and flow. They come and go in that game a lot. So that's sort of a unique case. But in most games, availability is just when is a character recruited, how early are they recruited. Now, in the case of both Rolf and especially Nephany, actually in both games, the availabilities are actually pretty decent, right? Rolf is recruited, again, only on like Chapter 9 of Path of Radiance. Again, devoid of his incredibly low bases and incredibly low starting level. He's not too bad as far as when he's recruited. And in Radiant Dawn, he's recruited with the Grail Mercenaries, which is also just pretty good. Again, really low level, really weak, but just as far as availability is concerned, he's not too bad. Nephany is also not too bad in Path of Radiance, and is actually quite good in Radiant Dawn. I actually think one of the reasons she's okay in Radiant Dawn is because she actually has quite good availability. She's available in Part 2, basically all the chapters, except I think the Crimean Knights chapter, and then she's available pretty early on in the Grail Mercenaries. Now, unfortunately, despite having pretty good availability, both these characters have bad class and bad bases, which is what we just talked about, but their availability isn't too bad, right? So at least they have that going for them. But availability can kind of make or break a unit. There's a lot of units that are recruited so late in the game that they don't matter. The trainees from Sacred Stones is something that I've heard about. Some people have recommended to me that they're not as bad as I say they are. But again, they just get so dunked, outside of Ross, obviously. They just get so dunked by that late recruitment. They have other problems, like obviously their bases are bad. But availability is extremely important and can absolutely make or break a character. So again, these are the three things that I look for when evaluating characters. And unfortunately, if we're talking specifically about Rolf and Nephany, they basically fail at least on 2 of 3. But just having good availability doesn't really make you a great character. Or just having a class doesn't make you a good class doesn't make you a great character. You need at least, I would say, 2 of 3, and 3 of 3 makes you a really fantastic character. So I hope that gives at least a decent sort of I don't know, like guideline for what makes a good character or a bad character. Next up, we're going to be talking about, again, I think the thing that's going to be really important, which is what people say and how I think this isn't, not disingenuous, but it's not correct, and we'll break that down. So we'll talk about that next. All right, and finally in the video, again, I want to talk about the most common response I get, and that response is somebody who says, I used so-and-so character, I used Rolf, I used Nephany on my playthrough. They were absolutely amazing. They absolutely dominated the game. How can you say they're a bad unit? They were so good for me. And my response to this is pretty obvious, I think, which is don't be results oriented, right? Now, this isn't some competitive trading card game, but if you've ever played a game competitively and actually evaluated your play, you would know that like being results oriented is extremely bad. Simply because a play worked out or a character was good for you, that does not make them a great character. And I'm going to finally explain why I have my Fire Emblem 6 gameplay going on in the background, and you've been watching Nino basically destroy shamans for the past 10 minutes or whatever as I've been talking, which is that if you just took this as an isolated incident, Nino would look like the best character in Fire Emblem 7, and yet she is one of the very worst characters in Fire Emblem 7. The amount of effort that I had to put in to get Nino this strong by this chapter to be able to do anything at all was fairly egregious. I basically spent an entire chapter just training Nino. Nino is not a good character in Fire Emblem 7 whatsoever, but if you just looked at this, she would look like, again, maybe the best character in the entire game. And this goes for a lot of my low tier runs. You know, the end game of our Sacred Stones low tier run was absolutely dominated by Emilia and Iwan. But again, that does not make them great characters. I had to put so much effort into getting them as strong as they were. Fire Emblem 6, you know, I've used Wendy a ton. I've boosted her and just used her a bunch. She's been awesome. But again, so much effort was necessary to be put into those characters. So this response, I don't think is very good. And if you play through the game, and I think this often comes from people who play through the game maybe only a couple of times, maybe not on the hardest difficulty. Now, difficulty does not change like character utility, right? Nephany is not a better character on easy than she is on Maniac, because she's still that much worse than Oscar. He's just going to dominate more, or any number of other characters. But it's a lot harder, I think, to see just how good characters are or just how bad characters are when you're playing on the easier modes. Now, I'm not claiming that that's necessarily what these people are doing, but when I was younger, I played through Sacred Stones and Path of Radiance a million times, all on the easiest difficulty, and I could not. My tier list would have looked all over the map. It would have been absolutely terrible. So I completely understand and empathize with it, but you have to understand that these characters, they're not actually good just because they were successful in a playthrough. If you put time and effort, and this is the most important thing, if you take one thing away from this video, I say this all the time, please take this. If you put time and effort into basically any character in Fire Emblem, especially growth units, they will be awesome. Wendy, Ewan, Amelia, Nino, these are all great examples. Again, you can go to my channel, watch my playthroughs, and look at just how strong they were in the end, and understand that they can be really strong. Any character can be really good, or at least most characters. Some are questionable, but that does not make them better than other characters in the game. That's not what we look for in like character quality and a tier list. So I hope that explained that, because again, this is like the most common response that I get. People are like egregious or flabbergasted, I guess you could say, that like a character that they used and really love like isn't considered a good character. But I'm sorry, it's just not a good character. The other thing I wanted to mention here at the end is another response I get pretty commonly, which are units who wind up in the end stronger than other units, so that therefore they are better. The most common, I guess, or the most recent was somebody who I was having a discussion with in regards to Lina and Lou. And the fact that Lilina was better because in the end she's going to be stronger. Now, whether that's true is sort of irrelevant. In the end, like, Lilina will have more magic, but Lou will be faster and more consistent. I don't know, it doesn't matter. But the point is, like, when you're evaluating those kind of characters, you can't just look at where they are in the end, right? Because by the time you're recruiting Lilina in Fire Emblem 6, Lou is already level, 10, 15, maybe ready to promote on that chapter. So you're essentially comparing Lilina to, a level 15 Lou or something along those lines. So I think that's also another sort of flawed way of thinking, that if you're just looking at, in the end, when I max out every character, who is actually the strongest. Now, you can absolutely think that way. And if you want to, make a tier list of, in the end, who's the strongest mage in Fire Emblem 6, cool, by all means. But Lilina is not a better character than Lou, simply because maybe she's stronger when they're both level 20 sages or whatever. So I just wanted to touch on that. Again, I'm not trying to call anybody out. If I've had a conversation with you recently about one of these characters, I'm just using this as, I think, a learning opportunity, hopefully, for people, at least to explain my perspective and how I evaluate characters. And maybe people could watch this and get a better idea for, when I make a top 5 list, what I mean when I call a character bad. Because again, I want to emphasize this. I want to mention this one more time. When I call a character bad, that does not mean that playthrough that you had where they were great and they were amazing and you love using them was flawed or bad or wrong, right? It just means that had you used Oscar in Nephene's place, you probably would have had an easier time in the game. In fact, not probably, you definitely would have had an easier time in the game. So, yeah, I don't know. I hope this video wasn't too rambly and at least had some decent information in it. That is the end of the video. I got nothing else here today. So thanks everybody for watching. As always, if you agree with me, if you don't agree with me, feel free to put it in the comments. And if I still get a comment talking about how great Nephene is when I make another top 5 list, I'll still respond to it and try to explain my perspective. It's just how I am. So yeah, again, thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you in the next one.